And I'm here with Tom Wilson. Thank you very much for joining me in the studio, Tom.
It's good to be here. We're international today?
We're very international. Well, you're international. You just got back from Nashville, where it's warmer.
A little bit, but you know, since we're on the topic of weather, and it's very cold here in Montreal right now, Nashville is comparable to Niagara Falls, where you're from, in Hamilton, most of the winter, except for about 4 to 6 weeks where we go into the deep freeze. But it's cold. It's cold enough down in Nashville.
Well, Tom, you're here to talk about this book, Beautiful Scars, and this is kind of an autobiography of your life. And I'm just wondering, having read this, are you surprised that you're even here? I mean, or not even perhaps in the Shadog Psychiatric Hospital?
Well, my God, you really did read the book. Yeah, the book is part of a process for me. It's part of, you know what? Writing the book, how's this? Writing the book saved me hundreds of thousands of dollars in therapy. Pretty well. But, yeah, I mean, the reflection on my life, I mean, it's less memoir or autobiography as it is a collection of stories that add up to one big story.
A catharsis as well?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Did you really steal a double bass as a child?
Yeah, I stole everything as a child. When you're a child, they don't suspect you're going to steal everything, you know. So as an adult and looking like the way I do, I'm usually suspect for anything.
So from a sort of a religious-based band as a young kid, you got into a junk house, rock and roll, and then one of the coolest bands in Canada right now, Blackie and the Rodeo Kings. What kind of life do you think you would have had you understood your origins at the time? Because it seemed to me that throughout most of your life there was this undercurrent of not understanding what you were about.
There's a lack of maternal bonding for kids that are adopted, and I can only speak for myself. Mind you, I was raised in a house with Bunny and George Wilson, who I only found out 5 years ago were my great aunt and uncle. They gave me everything. As I say in the end of the book, they gave me a fighting chance, you know. And really, also, as I said in the end of the book, all you can really ask for in this life is a fighting chance. But even though they gave me as much as they could, and George Wilson was blinded in the Second World War. He was a tail gunner in a Lancaster bomber. And as you know, or maybe you know or you don't know, but the tail gunner seat in those Lancaster and Halifax bombers were known as the suicide seat in the Second World War. A lot of those guys, young men that sat in those seats, didn't come home. George Wilson did, but he came home a broken man, blinded, and with a severe head injury. So they were older. So I noticed at a young age that my parents were older than the other parents on the street, you know, that the other parents were smoking cigarettes and they drank beer out of the bottle, you know what I mean? And the women wore mini skirts, and all the mothers were pretty hot, you know, and the men were steel workers in the Stelco or Dofasco. So I noticed the difference between Bunny and George, who were quieter and older and more refined, and they were already warriors, retired warriors. They had already had great battles in their life.
Tell me what it was like to grow up in Hamilton, because that's a tough town. It was always a tough town.
It was always a tough town. You don't notice it as much, but as I started to write the book and about my neighborhood, I grew up on the East Mountain of Hamilton, which, if you drive through it now, looks like beautiful little, you know, semi-suburban type of older neighborhood. But there was a lot of people moving to Hamilton, transient families coming in for work in the steel companies and industry. There was a ethnic mixture of you know, Italian and Portuguese. There was the line that was very distinctly drawn between Catholics and Protestants, and there was also you know, mobsters and bikers and people living in trailers on lots. You know, houses hadn't been built, and Hamilton in general was you know, the mountain is where people moved, you know, to kind of get away from the downtown part of the city. But you know, as I started talking to friends who grew up there, it's like every time you walked out the front door, you know, you were usually getting in a fight of some kind. You know, there was always conflict. People were quite, let's say, worked up in Hamilton.
Or downtrodden by life in many cases.
Yeah, I guess so. But you know, these were people that were fighting for everything they got. You know, and that included you know, those barriers between Catholic and Protestant and ethnic differences. They weren't ironed out, and less I guess liberal way of thinking. You know, basically, but you just kind of beat the crap out of each other.
Well, tell me how that atmosphere it was conducive to some of the great music that came out of this city.
Well, there is an air in the city besides the industrial air. There's nobody patting you on the head telling you you're doing a good job for artists, writers, creators. So there is, as Rick Danko from the band used to say, there's the sound of desperation in the air that you have to really fight, you know, for your art in Hamilton, because people... there wasn't a community for that kind of thing. As a result, in my mind, some of the greatest singers, musicians, and thinkers came out of my neighborhood and out of neighborhoods in Hamilton. To name a few, King Biscuit Boy, who Muddy Waters named the greatest white blues singer and harmonica player in the world. Grew up in my neighborhood. He was a guy that was produced by Alan Toussaint in New Orleans. He was asked to join the Allman Brothers Band, but he didn't, which, you know, was kind of a foolish move. But King Biscuit Boy won Daniel Lanois. You know, the Lanois brothers, they were the epitome of desperation and the need to get where they needed to go. They were two skinny French-Canadian kids with big afros selling LSD out in front of the Woolworth store in Hamilton. And with that money, they got enough money to buy some recording equipment. Daniel Lanois was a guy that made up a bunch of cards that said Dan Lanois, record producer. And when he was asked what that was, he said, well, I'm not really sure, but I'm going to give out these cards and see if I can be a record producer. And everybody said, well, that'll never work. Which, you know, of course, Daniel Lanois went on to produce some of the greatest recordings of the last 30 years. Teenage Head, you know, who were a punk rock band. But they, when these artists stepped out of Hamilton, they were different from the rest of the crowd. You know, they were different from the Toronto crowd for sure. Hamilton, as artists, really looked towards Buffalo and Michigan, Detroit in particular, for their inspiration. So bands like the MC5 and Iggy and the Stooges and Motown, you know, Stan Celeste from Buffalo, those were the people that that was the sound that influenced Hamilton. It wasn't necessarily the Yonge Street sound, even though the band and Ronnie Hawkins were planted on Yonge Street. They spent a lot of their time rolling up and down Highway 6, down to Lake Erie, Port Dover. Robbie Robertson, just south of Hamilton, is the Six Nations Mohawk Reserve. You know, where Robbie Robertson spent his summers. It's where migrant workers and tobacco fields and the Mohawks all integrate into this stew of culture that's created and has been being created, you know, for generations down south of Hamilton.
You, throughout this book, it seems like this, again, as I mentioned, there's this undercurrent of wondering where your origins were. And I'm just wondering, in your own turmoil, because you lived a turmoiled life, shall we say.
Yeah.
And I wonder, was that in part a cry for somebody to take you and give you a slap on the side of the head and say, smarten up kind of thing?
Completely. There was definitely a lack of identity. When I talk about this stuff, this is not a sob story, because I am probably happier than I've ever been in my life right now. At 58, I'm surrounded by love. I have kids, I have grandkids. I have a lot of love in my heart, and I have a lot of love surrounding me. But not really sure of where you're from or who you are. That can really screw up a guy or a girl, you know. And that's when I talk about, I can only speak of one adopted person, and that's myself. But I imagine that it's a thread that runs through most people who are adopted and don't know who their mother and father was, are either on that search or are completely in the dark. And there's a sense, even as a kid, at 4 years old, I asked Bunny Wilson, who was my mother, who was actually my great aunt, I said, how come you guys are older than the other parents? And, you know, how come there's no baby pictures of me and there's no stories about me coming back from the hospital? I asked that question when I was 4. I don't remember that one. I asked it when I was 10, and I stopped asking when I was 14 because Bunny, throughout that time, came up with one answer, and that was, there were secrets about you, Tommy, that I'll take to my grave. Which is, she's from Montreal. She's rather dramatic, I have to say. And but that's pretty severe, you know, to lay on somebody, and it leaves a giant question mark that stays on the top of your head, and it stayed on the top of my head until I hit the age of 53 and met a stranger. I was going on a speaking tour, and I got in the back of a limousine to go to the airport. And she goes, oh, this is going to be great. I'm a big fan of yours, and you don't know this, but your family and my family are friends. And I said, you know, I hear that a lot because of my last name being Wilson. But I explained George Wilson was blinded in the Second World War. The house was rather depressed. My parents were older, and the only people, that ever got in the home were relatives that came from this area in Quebec, Montreal, here in Ganawage. So I said, you know, I don't think that you're right about that. And she goes, oh, no, my grandmother's name was Mary Brennan. She was friends with your mother, and at that point I remembered her grandmother's name. I remembered her grandmother from being a preschooler, and my heart burst open because suddenly Bunny Wilson, I realized, had a friend in Hamilton. She goes, yes, in fact, my grandmother and Bunny Wilson were so close that she was there the day you were adopted. And I said, what? That started this journey from 53. Now, a lot of people ask me, did that shake your foundation? And it, in fact, was a shock. But if I would have found out when I was in my 20s or 30s, I would have fallen apart. I would have basically all those drugs and all that alcohol and all that hard living that I was doing would have killed me for sure.
Well, I'm just wondering how that affected the way you expressed yourself in music, because I know one of the songs on Junk House, for example, is "I'm Going Right Out of My Head."
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that's kind of autobiographical.
Well, I in fact did go right out of my head. Yes, I mean that was that was a different time, the '90s, but it is definitely affecting my art now, and it's not a conscious decision of waking up to write songs about myself in between Hamilton, Ontario, and the Mohawk culture, but those songs are coming out the same way the book came out. It's natural that we're going to write about our own personal human condition, and so that's where I'm at right now, and I'm very happy writing about that. And as I said, this is part of a process. When you finish this book, when you get through the last pages, the book's continuing right now. And I'll just give you an example of this, and I'm sure you can edit this interview if you need to, and you probably will. But there was a family that were a mystical family, like the Miller family. What happens was I was born in Hamilton. And I was put into a Catholic orphanage nursery, and then I was in a foster home with the Millers for almost a year. And that family I wrote about a little bit in the book, even though I didn't know anything about them. They too were from the East Mountain in Hamilton. And I did an interview with the Hamilton Spectator with a guy named Graham Rockingham. And we were talking a little bit about the book and about Blackie and the Rodeo Kings, who were on tour at the time. And I talked to him. I said, yeah. And I told him just what I told you, that I was in a foster home by the Millers. I said, I don't know who the Millers are. I said, they're like unicorns or elves or something. You know, they don't really exist. And sure enough, somebody read the article in the Hamilton Spectator and wrote in and said, I'm so-and-so Miller. Tom Wilson was in my home. He was the baby that my mother adopted. And their Mrs. Miller, who I'm going to meet in the next couple weeks, she was heartbroken. She never really got over me. She used to walk by my home, her daughter said, when, to see if she could see me. And so there's a whole other story there. There's a whole other chapter of the book that is starting to come You know, there's still information coming, you know. And the wealth of being able to find out who you are at the age that I am. You know, I'm celebrating, in 2 weeks I'll be 19 years clean and sober. And I couldn't ask for a better gift but to keep my own personal story going.
Well, Tom Wilson, it's been great talking to you, and it's been great reading the book. Most interesting.
Yeah.
And again, I'm glad you survived, because it was touch and go there, I think, in a lot of places.
Yeah. Well, you know, you could have been there to help me out years ago.
Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.